Welcome to Advanced T, and this is a lecture about some sort of advanced strategic concepts in topicality debates. I assume that most of you guys are familiar with sort of the basic run of topicality debates, what the four parts of a T argument are, how to answer T, etc. So a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are some sort of nuanced arguments about debating the counterinterpretation, some arguments about criticisms of T, and then some just sort of general strategic advice about when you should go for T, when you shouldn't go for T, and how to operationalize some strategic concepts about T. So the first thing I want to talk about is the counterinterpretation and sort of how the competing interpretations actually plays out in debate rounds. A lot of times people simply think that if they read some counterinterpretation on topicality, that will be enough that they can read just any counterinterpretation, and that will get them out of the T debate, or at least will give them enough access to their standards arguments to get their opponent not to go for the T debate. But ultimately, if you read a counterinterpretation that doesn't, the question really is about what your counterinterpretation does for you, and about the way in which the counterinterpretation limits in or limits out a range of affirmative cases that you think are bad or you think are good. And moreover, it's a debate about whether it is good or bad to include or to exclude the affirmative. And the first thing that you should always keep in mind is that when you are debating topicality, if you are the negative, the fundamental thrust of your interpretation level arguments and your standard level arguments is always that the affirmative, the particular affirmative that they have chosen to read, is bad, because that affirmative robs you of ground, because that affirmative is unpredictable. And even if your argument is this affirmative is bad because it would justify other bad affirmatives, your argument still has to be predicated on an argument about why their interpretation is bad, precisely because it includes an affirmative that should not be included in the range of topical affirmatives and should not be included in the debate. By contrast, if you are the affirmative, your counterinterpretation level arguments will all center on one question, which is why it is good in this debate to include your affirmative. And this leads to a couple of different, and basically the basic conclusion of this is that it is really important for you to have an argument about why your affirmative is the core of the topic, why your affirmative is the affirmative that everybody should be entitled to, because absent your ability to read that affirmative, you would be way behind in terms of the strategic options that are available to you, in terms of the types of ground that you can access in the debate, and so on and so forth. And that doesn't necessarily mean that your affirmative has to be the most predictable one on the topic, or that your affirmative is the most obvious affirmative. But you do need an argument about why the affirmative that you have chosen to read in this debate is an affirmative that you should be entitled to read. And this is especially important if you're reading critical affirmatives, or if you're reading some sort of performance affirmative, if you're reading an affirmative that talks about why you have to be entitled to speak from your social location. All of those arguments that you make in those sorts of debates, most of them will center on an argument about why that particular sort of methodology, why your sort of representations, why all of that stuff, why that is uniquely key in the debate space. And all of those arguments are reasons to prefer the counterinterpretation to the extent that they include your affirmative. And you can always just sort of reverse engineer the counterinterpretation debate by saying that even if in a vacuum they make arguments about why predictability or limits or ground are better in a world of better in a world of their interpretation, they fundamentally are bad because they exclude your affirmative, and that your affirmative is something that you should get to read for all of the reasons that you have made out in the 1AC or whatever. Keep in mind too that this also leads to a little bit of a nifty trick on the part of the MG, which is the following. A lot of the times, so how many of you in critique debates have ever heard of permutation do the alt in all other instances. There's a very similar argument that you guys can make in topicality debates, which is that you can say counterinterpretation, your interpretation plus our AF. And really, this is a really nifty trick because a lot of the times it will resolve every single one of their standards arguments, except predictability often. If they make an argument about why they couldn't predict your AF and that uniquely put them at a strategic disadvantage, your counterinterpretation plus our AF probably doesn't solve that. But arguments about limits, right? What's the marginal difference in limits between the range of affirmative cases that their counterinterpretation purports to include and that same range of cases plus one AF, right? What's the difference in terms of limits? In terms of ground that's allocated to each side, what's the difference between their argument, between the range of ground that they say that the affirmative should have and the range of ground that they say the affirmative should have plus your AF, right? And again, you can make the same sort of double bind argument that you might make in a critique debate here, because you can say that, look, either it's not a big deal because it's just one more AF, or to the extent that that one AF is really important, then all of our reasons why the AF is uniquely critical to our ground, to our ability to argue in this debate, all of those are reasons why you should prefer an interpretation that includes our ground. And you can make those same sort of arguments for why you should be able to read counterinterpretation, their interpretation plus our affirmative. Because fundamentally, if the counterinterpretation debate is one about which set of affirmatives should be included or excluded, then any argument about why your affirmative is the affirmative that should be included in the debate is really important. The flip side of this, if you are the negative, is that you need arguments not just about sort of ground or predictability or whatever in a vacuum, but you need arguments about why their affirmative is particularly bad, right? And the arguments about why their affirmative is particularly bad should always be focused on the particular sort of wording of the plan and the mechanism by which the plan is enacted, right? Because you always want to be able to make the argument that, look, you could have still been able to talk about the same sort of broad brush issues, right? There was always a topical version of your plan text that you could have read. And that you could have read, and the fact that your plan text either is bad in a vacuum or is bad because it justifies a range of other abusive plan texts, that's not the fact that you want to talk about this issue isn't a reason that we should prefer that interpretation in a debate about competing interpretations, because you could have written a topical version of your plan text that would have solved all of our offense on the standards debate. And so, when you are negative, you always want to be thinking on the standards debate and on the and framing your interpretation about what you could, about how that interpretation could have included the same advantage areas, and about how the fact that they want to read their affirmative case isn't a reason that they should get to operate in the world of that interpretation. Keep in mind too that as the negative, you want to be sensitive to the question of what the two interpretations look like next to each other. And this is important because as a negative, occasionally they will read an interpretation that really doesn't clash with your interpretation. And in that situation, there are times when it is okay to sort of read a permutation of the 2AC's counterinterpretation. So the basic idea here is that a counterinterpretation has to be competitive with the original affirmative interpretation, much in the same way as a counterplan has to be competitive with the original plan. So the permutation in a competing interpretations in a topicality debate is simply a test of whether the counterinterpretation is competitive. And I'll give you an example. So let's say that the topic is that the USFG should increase funding for right, suppose that's a topic, standard topic, you'll probably see it sometime this year. And the 1AC says we should increase funding we should be spending for hydropower. The 1NC says topicality, that alternative energy does not equal hydropower. The 2AC says counter-interpretation. Alternative energy equals hydro, wind, solar. QNC says what? Anyone take crack at this? Yeah.
Still get to talk about wind and solar without talking about hydro.
Correct. Permutation is A equals. Exactly right. So, and here, yeah, go ahead.
And then in that case, you would specifically try and give a bunch of reasons why hydropower isn't all to what wind and solar is.
Well, presumably when they read their counter-interpretation, they will make arguments about why it is critical to have a definition of alternative energy that includes wind power, includes solar power, includes hydropower. And they'll make, a lot of times they'll make arguments about topic lit, they'll make arguments about ground, they'll make an limits argument. And you can make the argument that, look, all of your arguments about, for instance, if they say that your interpretation that AE can't be hydropower is over-limiting, you can say we substantially resolved your limits question because we still give you a range of alternative energies involving wind power, solar power. We just limit out hydropower, and all of our reasons why hydropower is an unpredictable or unfair affirmative are reasons that you should prefer the permutation as opposed to counter-interpretation. And you could give arguments about why, for instance, the ground that the affirmative has to read cases about wind power or solar power is more important than their ability to read arguments about hydropower. And that even if they would have more ground in a world where the topic included a discussion of hydropower, that still isn't a reason to give them hydropower ground, a world where you're winning arguments about why hydropower is bad ground for the affirmative to be able to have. Yeah?
Would you flow this kind of on the bottom of the T sheet? Because I have those always get super messy when there's like in terms of counter.
Yeah, I think that, you could flow it on the bottom of the T sheet. We're going to talk about some sort of ways of flowing T and ways to structure T for the judge later, but it may be worth separating out this sort of debate from the rest of the debate. You can always label it as a regional overview. You can always make it part of a global overview. And those are often good places to put these sorts of arguments. But fundamentally, right, this is just an argument about why one definition in a debate subsumes another. And so there are a variety of places where, or just come up with another example. Well, no, that goes the opposite direction. But I think that here, the reasons that permutations on topicality are good are the same reasons that permutations on counterplanes are good, or the same reasons that permutations on critique alternatives are good. And it's a test of competition, and it forces the affirmative not only to read a counter-interpretation, but to read a counter-interpretation that is competitive with the original negative interpretation. And that if the affirmative's counter-interpretation is not competitive or is totally consistent with the 1NC's interpretation, then that's not a reason that the 2AC's interpretation would be able to resolve the questions about ground, about limits, about predictability, if that interpretation isn't ultimately competitive. Now, You can also make arguments, that these sorts of permutations are good because they incentivize affirmatives to read competitive counter-interpretations, that they incentivize affirmatives to engage in better counter-interpretation writing, and all of those arguments about why, forcing the affirmative to defend forcing them to defend the counter-interpretation not only vis-a-vis the original interpretation, but also be the permutation, especially if we're debating a world of competing interpretations, where the idea is that we're trying to find the best interpretation of the resolution and to find sort of the best definition that tells us what the topic means, then certainly it seems like the negative should have access to a permutation to resolve the question of what the best definition is and to make arguments about why the affirmative standards arguments aren't resolved by the counter-interpretation alone. There might also be some reasons why it is not legitimate to perm a counter-interpretation on topicality. For instance, you may make arguments that this really screws with the affirmative's ability to generate offense because they only have the MG to generate new offense on topicality, and there's no way that they can anticipate what the permutation will be, and that fundamentally that allowing the negative to read the permutation would functionally allow them to restart the debate in the MOC and to change sort of the frame in which the topicality debate gets evaluated in a way that would never allow the affirmative to win debates. I don't find this claim to be particularly compelling because it seems like the affirmative could resolve all these problems simply by reading a competitive counterinterpretation in the first instance. And if they don't read a competitive counterinterpretation, then that's their own fault and they should lose. And presumably they'll be induced to write better counterinterpretations in the future. So that's basically the counterinterpretation debate. And I guess now, the next topic, which is a topic that a lot of people have seemed interested in after rounds, has been sort of the critique of topicality. So I just sort of want to get a sense from you guys about what sorts of critique of T or critique of procedurals you guys are running, what you've seen people running, and how maybe we can brainstorm as a group to try to figure out how to answer some of these.
I have one right here.
Well, I mean, what's the argument? Just really briefly. I'll get to you in a sec. Yeah.
Like static interpretations and definitions have been used to exclude marginalized groups.
Okay. So keep in mind that there are sort of two things going on in this argument. One is an argument about why static interpretations are bad. And this is and I think that this is distinct from the argument about sort of marginalized groups, right? Because that begs the question of what groups are marginalized, why are those groups important, why is it uniquely key to include their voices? And I think especially in a lot of debate rounds where people make the arguments that we need to include either the voices of a particular marginal population or our own voices to the extent that we speak from a unique sort of subject position and social location, that an interpretation that would exclude those sort of voices is particularly bad. So that is one common argument. Anyone else? What other critique of T type arguments, critique of procedurals type arguments? I mean, I think one very common one might be, an argument that X term of art has been hijacked. And that the 1AC is a reappropriation of that term. And these arguments, and this argument is good to the extent that it focuses not just sort of on a general argument about why topicality is bad or why procedural is bad, but rather it focuses on why the affirmative should be entitled to talk about and critique a specific term in the resolution. One example of this is that at the GSL tournament this year, there was a topic about a balanced budget amendment. And we had an argument that said that we should pass a constitutional amendment that allocates either 1.5% or 2% of the federal budget to health and wellness resources for low-income communities. And our argument was that the term balanced budgets has been hijacked by the right, and it has been used to justify a particular sort of anti-welfare agenda that has really hit minorities hard. We don't necessarily believe this argument, but this is an argument we made. And so we said that it was important to use the affirmative as a space to create sort of a genealogy of the term balanced budgets and to sort of invert that term and show what balanced budgets really are not balanced. And of course, this argument is, it's creative, and it also allowed us to be the exact opposite of the topic, which was nice. And that'll get to some arguments that you might make against against sort of the critique of T later. Other arguments about the critique of T. If you're reading any sort of argument that is a vaguely Foucault-inspired, I think it's very easy to make a critique of T argument about the way in which topicality is used as sort of a tool of disciplining people and about creating sort of bottom-up discourses that attempt to limit out the type of topics that people can talk about, much in the same way that Foucault in The History of Sexuality, Bottom 1, he describes the mechanism by which in Victorian England people, there was sort of a taboo on talking about sex, not because the government enforced such a taboo, but rather because they were local and proliferated discourses that told people what topics it was acceptable to talk about and what topics it was not acceptable to talk about. And there was sort of these organic regime of self-imposed silences, and that was the mechanism by which widespread sort of sexual repression, blah, 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 happened. And similarly, you might make the argument that in debate, because of the way in which debate is sort of a self-policing activity, and one in which the rules are not set top down, but they're set bottom up, and topicality functions as sort of an ingrained tool that is used to discipline people into debating in a particular way, and that is used to exclude arguments that might sort of cut against the grain of arguments that we sort of expect people to make. Yeah?
I've also seen that same type of argument used as a preempt to a T. So in the criteria, under definitions, it's like a really quick, Foucault says, words have a meaning and blah, 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 and then go on with the rest of the case.
Yeah.
I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, that gets at two issues. One is an issue of where you should put your preemption arguments, whether you should be preempting T, coming out of the 1AC, and that brings up some strategic considerations we'll talk about in a few minutes. The other is, there is this argument that just words don't have static meaning. Not only that static meanings are used to exclude, but simply that there's no such thing as sort of universal truth or universal language, and that words are only sort of our attempt to sort of grapple at the dark for meaning and for truth, and all they can do is sort of like a rough approximation, much like, if any of you have ever read Plato, the allegory of the shadows in the cave, that all that words are doing is merely approximating concepts, but that there's never sort of a perfect fit, and there's never sort of static meaning behind words. And moreover, that words not only don't have static meaning, but their meaning is often culturally constructed, and the 1AC can be a site to look at the way in which certain terms are culturally constructed, and to look at the way in which certain terms have been appropriated meaning and appropriated power. You had a question?
Yeah, is that Rorty?
Well, Rorty...
He talks something about that, doesn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Rorty makes similar sorts of arguments like that. I think that Rorty sort of positions himself sort of in conversation with Foucault, but I think he does sort of acknowledge that, that words can only sort of be an imperfect mirror of truth. And yeah, I think that if you guys want to read more about that, there's a book called Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, where Rorty sort of expounds upon the extent to which words can sort of mirror reality and the extent to which they can really map on to what we understand as being or what we understand as sort of, you know, the world that we all live in and be in.
So this means I get to conduct my AF in like 70s era jive talking, and it's not topical.
Well, I mean, that's it's an argument you make. I mean, certainly, and this actually, just to take a brief detour from the critique of T, remember that there are also ways to read critical affirmatives that are sort of, that have non-topical advantage areas, and that don't have, and that they're still literally topical. And there are two basic strategies that you guys can use to do this. One is the affirmative that, you know, is literally topical, but there's something weird about the way in which it is framed or the weird way in which it is set. One example, for instance, and I talked about this in the last T lecture I gave, is that there was a topic that said that the DPRK should, make, like, extend an olive, not, it wasn't worded like this, but the DPRK should extend an olive branch to the Republic of Korea, you know, that they should significantly improve relations with the Republic of Korea. And so we had an affirmative that basically just read the resolution as a plain text, but then we made arguments about the upcoming Truman election and about how, how Stalin was, taking over Russia and how he was going to expand North Korea and how now is the critical time for the DPRK to make overtures to the Republic of Korea. And our advantage was a critique of Deal and Yarrow's time. And so we're literally topical, but our advantage, our solvency mechanisms and our advantage clearly have nothing to do with the topic as it is set in 2013. But nonetheless, you're literally topical. The other thing too is that a lot of affirmatives, have started not saying, they say things like, we believe that or we advocate that, the resolution, right? And their advantages are not predicated on the enactment of a topical plan text by the US federal government or whoever the actor in the resolution is, but rather their advantages are predicated on their sort of performance or their speech act of talking about, their relation to the resolution or their interaction with the subject position of the resolution, right? And you see this way more and more and more because literally people will say, oh, T, you're not actually defending the enactment of a topical plan text, and they're like, of course we do. Our advocacy statement is the resolution. How could we not be topical? And it seems like people shouldn't be able to get away with that, but they do, and they do over and over and over and over and over and over again. So those are sort of two common tricks that people use to read critical affirmatives and try to sidestep the topicality debate, and ones that you should be aware of.
So
Go ahead.
Oh, so I came across that yesterday. So what's a good way to counter that, other than to try and drive down the need for specifics in enacting a plan to solve the resolution?
Okay. So for the first one that I described, the literally topical plain text, it just has some funny mechanism to it. Sometimes there's not a lot you can do, and you just have to sort of make more garden variety solvency arguments, or engage with the substance of the argument. Although then again, if you can't make an argument about why we should think about time as something that goes forward, you might not deserve to win the debate. In the second instance, I think there's a very plausible argument that that you could go two ways. One is that you could make sort of a general theory argument about why the affirmative has to advocate the enactment of a topical plan text by the US federal government, and to make arguments about why that is good for limits, about why that's good for predictability, about why that's good for ground and your access to stable disad and counterplan links, about why this is good for sort of policy making education. And you can sort of, and these procedurals are always weird because they seem to be a combination of T arguments, and also just sort of more general policy goods, which cite vague good arguments. But you should certainly make those types of arguments. The other sorts of arguments you can make is sort of a affects topicality or an extra topicality argument that says that you do not get to, that the part of the advocacy statement that says that, we advocate that, or we believe that, or we endorse that, and that is extra topical, and that this is uniquely unfair in the instance of critical affirmatives because a lot of the times their advocacy, the advantages they garner will not be based upon the enactment of topical plan text by the U.S. federal government, but will rather be based on their advocacy and being like, look, we should win this debate because we perform and we speak from our social location. And that has nothing to do with the enactment of a topical plan text by the U.S. federal government. And so their ability to garner extra topical advantages off of a part of their advocacy statement that's not in the resolution, that has no textual basis in the resolution, is bad, especially to the extent that if the resolution forces you to defend USFG action, then having an advocacy statement that says, we refuse to defend USFG action, but we personally advocate that something happen, that seems like it would be problematic for reasons of ground, limits, etc. And again, too, a lot of people have tried to get out of this by making sort of quote-unquote solvency arguments that, once we, take the subject position in the round, that sort of causes some sort of radical epistemic break that will ultimately, lead to, solvency of whatever advantage they describe. But ultimately, even if that would make them effects topical, that's not, that's it. They would make them only effects topical. If they read a solvency argument about how their performance is key and how their performance would break down whatever issue they describe, and that them being effects topical is not good enough for the same reasons that effects topicality is generally bad. So how do we answer a criticism of T? What are some arguments we can make against the criticism of T?
Which one?
Any of them, just in general.
Rules can also be used to protect the minority.
Right. So again, rules good is a powerful argument, and even though a lot of critiques of topicality are just say that rules are bad, rules are these things that are artificially put in place by powerful groups to subvert the voices of the marginalized or the dispossessed. I think there are a lot of legitimate argument that rules and limits are good to the extent that they serve as an important check on government power, and they, especially in the United States, where presumably our rules are a product of democratic deliberation, and that they're not some artificial imposition of fairness on people, but rather that they sort of represent a broad democratic overlapping consensus about what sort of world we ought to live in, and what the good life ought to look like. And so I think you can make a lot of arguments about why rules are good and why rules are important to sort of protect minority groups. If you can make an argument about why rules have been good to protect the particular marginalized group they decide in the 1AC, that's even better. But you probably don't need it. It's probably just icing on the cake in terms of a general argument about why rules are bad. I want to talk really briefly about this word, fairness. It seems like a lot of critical affirmatives now have been making arguments that fairness is bad, that the way in which the term fairness is used or operationalized to exclude their voice is problematic, and so on and so forth. I think that one thing you should do when reading procedurals against these kind of critical affirmatives is that you need sort of a more robust conception of fairness and what fairness means. And I think, too, saying just that, fairness is about what ground is included or excluded, or fairness is about our ability to debate in the round, is probably not enough against these critical affirmatives. You want a conception of fairness that might be tied, for instance, to our role as participants in democratic decision-making, or our role as sort of, collective partners in deliberation who believe that, having debates about issues, that are sort of on a fair and level, that are on sort of a level and even playing field, is important, right? And I think that tying your arguments about fairness to sort of a liberal conception of politics, and one in which people are included and are able to participate, is important. Because just saying, fairness, and it's unfair because we didn't get to read our counterplan, that isn't going to get you very far against a lot of good critical affirmatives. And so I think that having an idea of fairness that, look, topicality is an issue about setting rules of the game. It's not about somebody else setting rules for us. It's about us setting rules for ourselves and creating the contours of democratic deliberation. And if we believe that debate is important as a space for sort of informed democratic participation, and is training for us to be citizens out there in the world who can really make, help make policy changes and can help influence the direction that our collective deliberation will take, then having some sort of baseline expectation of fairness and an agreement upon what issues will be discussed and what issues will not be discussed is important, to the extent that, we can't talk about everything in debate, and we shouldn't try to talk about everything in debate. And we have topics in debate because those topics help to guide our research, to make our deliberations more informed, and to help us illustrate sort of what the basic subject of discussion will be. And that absent an ability to have that sort of informed discussions, that there's no real hope for democratic politics, and that topicality is just a way of us sort of setting ground rules for democratic deliberation. There are a variety of arguments that you can make against these sort of critical affirmatives. Any argument about why switch side debate is good, any argument about why policy making is good, any argument about why, and again, remember that this goes back to the first point that I want to make in this lecture, which is that topicality debates are all about a question of what affirmatives are included or excluded, right? And so if you make arguments against a critical affirmative that says that your affirmative is bad, and that our interpretation of what the topic should look like and what the definition that should control this debate should look like, right, that definition is good precisely because it excludes your affirmative, and your affirmative is bad because it has bad methodology, because the way in which you think about this problem is bad, because there's a better way to think about this problem, that your methodology is fundamentally misguided, and blah, blah, blah. Then all of those arguments about why your affirmative is bad are reasons for a counter-interpretation that would exclude this interpretation to the extent that you believe that this is an affirmative that shouldn't be in the debate. I want to make a last point here, which is that one claim that commonly gets bandied around in these critique of topicality debates is that somehow, if enough people don't talk about the topic, that debate will collapse. I personally want to discourage you from making these sorts of claims. It seems like, I say this for two reasons. One is that they just generally don't seem to be very persuasive, and certainly the argument that if debate were to collapse, it probably would have collapsed already, seems to be a pretty devastating argument here. It's also kind of, I think it's a strategic mistake to make arguments about the collapse of debate, because a lot of critique of T arguments, in addition to these sorts of arguments, have made these arguments that are sort of pseudo sort of securitization arguments. That the use of topicality and other procedurals to sort of police the debate and to tell certain types of people and certain arguments that they can or can't be there based on, this fear-mongering about what would happen if these types of arguments were allowed, and that, that their affirmative is key to sort of break through this sort of, rigid exclusionary logic that said that these arguments are dangerous, so we shouldn't talk about them, or these arguments are pathological, so we shouldn't talk about them, right? And if you say, well, we shouldn't talk about it because if we talked about this argument, debate would collapse. right, that seems to be a link. And certainly, if people are going to be making these sorts of arguments, then making the argument that if we were to talk about your affirmative in the debate space, the debate would collapse, that people would leave, that seems to be a way of getting you into a lot of trouble. And it seems like there's not a lot of upside, and there's quite a bit of downside. On the other hand, everybody makes these arguments, so maybe they know something that I don't about why these arguments are valuable. And I was told that I'm not allowed to say that arguments are good or bad. This is my opinion. And so my opinion, which you can take for what it is that you shouldn't make arguments that debate will collapse. So that's the critique of topicality in a nutshell. I don't mean this to be the end-all and be-all of how to answer procedural arguments or to defend procedural against the critique of topicality or other arguments that say that topicality is exclusionary, only just to sort of flag some of the issues to let you know that people do run these arguments. And these are sort of some broad contours that you should think about. The next topic I want to talk about is move to some sort of strategic thinking. And we'll start with the negative, because the negative is the one that reads topicality. There are two major times when you are going to read T. One is when you expect to go for T, and one is when you don't expect to go for T. So let's talk about the latter. Why read topicality when you don't expect to go for T? Well, it wasn't a rhetorical question. That was a rhetorical question, but sure, Erwin.
I mean, it's a time suck.
Right. It's a time suck, and a lot of teams will really overinvest in T, and that's totally rational, because remember, you can't win on T, you can only lose on T, but if you lose T, that's it, right? No PMR has ever won a debate on the argument that we lost T, but that's okay, because the case outweighs. Nobody has ever won that argument. And so, you have an incentive to make sure you spend enough time in the MG to cover T. And certainly, you may have the impulse to say, we meet, LOL, not answering this argument. But that will probably lose you some debates that you probably should have won. And so most MGs will probably overcommit to T, especially if you read a relatively short T shell. And this is an important point, that the amount of time that the MG spends on topicality is not really linearly related to the amount of time that the LOC spends on topicality. Right? And to give you an example, there have been plenty of debates where the LO spends 45 seconds on topicality and the MG spends a minute 30 answering topicality, because they really, really, really don't want to lose on topicality. And so, remember what happens here though is that now the LOC has basically bought themselves 45 seconds of additional time in the debate. In a debate where each side only gets a total of 20 minutes to speak, that's almost like, that's like 4%, 5% of your time in the debate round that you have bought by reading a topicality argument that you have no intention of ever going for. So that is one reason that you might read topicality in the LOC, even if you never plan on going for it. The other reason is that you might read T to protect a link argument. And certainly if you want to read a disad and you think that your link argument may be a little bit tenuous, or you think that the AF may want to get out of your link argument, you might read a topicality argument to try to protect your link, or to sort of, tell the MG, it's like, don't no link our disad. We're watching you, and you know exactly what will happen if you no link the disad, right? And a lot of the times the MG will, again, because they're afraid to lose on T, they'll be like, okay, you can have your disad link, we'll make some other arguments, but disad link, all yours. And certainly, those are basically the two major reasons that you would read topicality in the LOC if you don't want to go for it. One thing, that if you're going to do this, you really don't want to tip your hand too much. And so, I generally think that there aren't a ton of ways in the LOC to really obviously tip your hand. I think you spend 30 seconds on topicality in the LOC, that probably tips your hand a little bit. If you stop flowing in the MG while they're answering T, that will tip your hand. So I guess one piece of advice is just to keep flowing until they're done with T. Unless you really have something more important to do, but you probably don't. And so yeah. On the other hand, sometimes the opposite is true, that you are going to want to go for T in the MO from the get-go. I guess this is pretty rare because I don't see you to really go for T these days. And it seems like usually when they go for T, it's something egregious. And there's sort of the generation of debaters who, whether they have a viable disad strategy and a K strategy, but they say, fuck it, we're going for T. Those days, I think, are past, or at least there aren't a lot of debaters who seem to like to do that. Am I wrong, or is there somebody I'm thinking? Are there people who like to do this sort of stuff? But, certainly, I mean, there were the Zach Sheetas of the world, who love to go for T every round, no matter what. But it's relatively rare. But nonetheless, you may want to go for T, especially because now that a lot of teams don't go for T, a lot of teams are really bad at answering T in the MG, and a lot of teams are really lazy in the MG when they answer T. And so, if you are going to go for T in the, and you know that you're going to go for T in the MO, then there are a few things I would say just to set yourself up to do that. One is that I think that you need to make sure that you start the reasonability versus competing interpretations debate in the LOC if you plan to go for T. I probably would have some articulation of standards arguments. I would probably think about what standards arguments you don't read and include preamps about why you outweigh those standards arguments. I think that I would start to provide some comparative arguments on the fairness versus education questions at the bottom of the debate in the LOC. And really just, I would flesh out arguments more, right? And it's not a question of more volume of arguments, but I think that having more detailed standards arguments in the LOC is really good if you do intend to go for T. And a lot of people are really unsophisticated, and when they hear you say T, they're just going to make the same 15 arguments or 10 arguments regardless of how much time you spend on T. And so certainly building in a lot of preamps on T can really help you if you do plan to go for it. So what about actually going for T in the MO? How do you do it? Well, in general, the way, so I was sort of like the dude who liked to go for T every round in my year, and so the way that I usually did it in the MO was as follows. The first thing would be to kick other positions and isolate abuse. And you could usually do, sometimes you could do both of those at the same time, right? Like, you could go to disad and go to their no link on the disad and say, we are not going for this disad, but extend this no link. This argument is predicated on blah, blah, blah definition of the topic, which we argue is something that should be crowded out by our, or this is predicated on this part of the plain text, which we argue is not topical, and that this argument proves the abuse, right? Keep in mind, too, that judges will oftentimes just, they'll see somebody kick a disad, or they'll see somebody perm a counterplan, or sorry, no link a disad, or perm a counterplan, and they'll be like, oh, shit, proof of abuse. And in reality, there's a lot of times when the no link on a disad may not actually be proof of the abuse on topicality, but nonetheless, if you have a sort of plausible argument why it is, it's worth doing that. And I would probably, if you have 2 instances of abuse that's better than 1, if you have 3 that's might be better than 2, might not, and if you don't have, and 4 or more, just there's no marginal benefit over 3 or 2, right? So I guess the magic number is 2, right? Find 2 places, ideally, where they have abused you in the debate, and isolate those as the first thing that you do in the MO when you go for T. The next thing that I think is really useful if you're going to go for T for 8 minutes, just because T debates tend to be sort of messy, gooey, etc., is a global overview. And typically, these are long, anywhere from 45 to 90 seconds. They can sometimes be longer on a T debate. I don't think they should be. And I think that these basically should do the following. You resolve the competing interpretations versus reasonability debate at the very top. I think that it's useful to have an articulation of why their counter-standard doesn't resolve your most important standards arguments, and an articulation of why their definition is bad, or why their affirmative is bad, and what ground you have lost as a result of their interpretation, right? And those three things, I think, are the most important part of your global overview. And I think that they're important because not only do they flag to the judge that this debate is a debate that should be resolved as a question of competing interpretations, but also that this, when you put the two interpretations side by side, this is why they're bad. This is why their affirmative is bad, this is why their interpretation is bad. And this is why the counter-interpretation just can't resolve our standards offense, which is the reason that our standard is the only one that is critical to protect, protect our ground and to set adequate and predictable limits in the debate. Right, something like that, yeah.
What was the third? I missed it.
Oh, the third is an explanation of just sort of what ground you've lost in the debate, how you've been abused, and sort of what the impact of voting on topicality is, right? Because keep in mind that when you are going for topicality, it's about convincing a judge that this is an important issue to vote on, that it's not a cheap shot, etc. And partly you already do that if you've been willing to commit 8 minutes in the MO to going for topicality. But you also want to give the judge something to sink onto, an explanation not merely of why you went for T because you don't have any other arguments in the debate you can go for, but also why you've gone for T because you've been profoundly abused in this debate and the topicality is the only way that you can protect yourself. And after that, go through the line by line. I do think that if you know that you're going to go for T in the MO, you want to make that decision like in the first 2 minutes of the MG. Because in topicality debates, if you're going to go for T as the MO, the way to do it is to be able to double, triple, or quadruple cover every argument that they make, and you're probably not going to be able to do that if you don't backflow answers. So use the time that you have in the MG after they stop answering T, to backflow answers, to write your overview. Try not to be too obvious about it because you get these instances where somebody is very clearly not flowing anything, and they're like, quick, go back to T, make more arguments, because it's very obvious what you're doing. But if you be a little bit sneaky about this and try to not to tip your hand too much that you're going for T in the block, although sometimes they'll be obvious, there's nothing you can do about it. And yeah, and then just do the line by line. One thing too is that if you want to go for T a lot, but your flowing isn't up to snuff, get better at it because judges seem to love to resolve topicality debates on little dropped arguments, much more so than in other debates. And so, especially if you're going to go for it in the MO, you just cannot afford to drop stuff. And you can mitigate the effect of dropping stuff to some extent in the overview because there you can just say they make the same argument on T over and over and over again. I'll answer it up top. But you don't want to do that too much. And some judges just won't give you the benefit of the doubt on dropped arguments in that way, even if you flag it in overview. So what do you do if you are the PMR and they have gone for topicality for the entire block? What do you do? Well, first thing you do is you hope that your MG made some substantive arguments against T. In all likelihood, if the MO has gone for T, it is probably because your partner has made a pretty big mistake in the MG. And so your job in the PMR a lot of times, if they've gone for T, is just to do something of a salvage operation where you have to isolate your best arguments and just really think to yourself during the LOR, just like, what are my best arguments, what are my most viable arguments, and then just go through them in sort of from best to worst. I think that if you were answering T in the PMR, volume is not helpful. Having a bunch of different arguments all over the place is not really useful, because if the MO has gone for T for 8 minutes and the LR has spent 4 minutes on it, they're going to be better developed on the whole than you will. And so your only chance of winning the debate is to find a few arguments that you can be better developed than them on, right? Because ultimately, it often only takes 1 or 2 arguments to win a topicality debate as the affirmative. And so you just want to isolate the few arguments that you really think are best, and to separate the wheat out from the chaff, and to make sure that those are the arguments you're telling the judge are important. And any arguments that you can make that you think will just completely resolve a standards issue, any arguments that you can make, a we meet is probably an argument that you should always go for in the PMR, even if it's not ordinarily your best argument. That's probably the one exception to the rule about going for your best arguments first. Because remember, a we meet is terminal defense on topicality, and so getting a judge to believe that there is some chance that you just don't violate their interpretation is always an argument worth going for in the PMR. But certainly, I would just find your best standards arguments, isolate them, and just sort of go through them in reverse order of importance. And yeah, I mean, obviously, how to give a good PMR on T is really not a whole lot different than how to give a good PMR generally. But just remember that if you've gone for topicality, in some ways you're in a very good position, because a lot of judges don't like to go on topicality, and a lot of judges, think it's a little bit of a cheap, wanky strategy. On the other hand, if they've gone for topicality, they've developed the issue much better than you, and you probably have made some mistake in the debate that has already put you at a disadvantage. And so you are going to be kind of sort of debating from behind in most PMRs. And I think that giving a PMR on T as if you were just generally debating from behind in the debate is not a horrible idea.